For weeks now, the story of what happened to Nolan Wells seemed pretty settled. At least publicly, anyway. You had a group of friends, a boat that ran into some mechanical issues, and a young man who decided to hang back on the island after everyone else packed it in and headed home. That was the story. Simple, tragic, but straightforward. Then, completely out of nowhere, a second timeline just dropped. And this one involves people who were never part of the original boat trip, a completely different time of day, and a claim about some kind of confrontation that nobody had ever mentioned publicly before. Now, if this turns out to be accurate, we're not just talking about adding one more little detail to this case. We're talking about completely rearranging the entire sequence of who was actually near Nolan in those final hours. This is the story of what's being called on national television the mystery altercation. And it's also the story of this very public, very heated argument happening right now among legal analysts, forensic experts, and journalists about whether this claim even deserves to be taken seriously at all.
Bombshell tonight in the Nolan Wells investigation, a mystery altercation emerges. And not with the guys that took him to the island on the boat. Does this change things?
So here's how this whole new thread entered the public conversation. I want you to notice something about the way the host framed this on air. They weren't drawing a conclusion. They weren't pointing fingers at anyone specific. They were asking a question. A question about whether something happened that afternoon involving people who had absolutely nothing to do with the boat everyone had already been discussing for weeks. Now, to really understand why this claim landed with such force, you've got to understand the timeline it's trying to insert itself into. According to the show's own investigative reporting, the boat known as the Triton, the vessel that Nolan had actually traveled to Horn Island on, departed the island at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. Got that? 4:30 p.m. The mystery altercation, as it's been described through social media accounts that the program reviewed, allegedly occurred around 5 o'clock. That's a full 30 minutes after that boat had already left. And there's more. A separate vessel, described as a Bertram, was reportedly seen departing the area shortly afterwards, and witnesses said it was moving at a notably high rate of speed. Not just leaving, hauling out of there.
We know about some mystery altercation. We think after the Triton left Horn Island.
This is a mystery altercation that is being described through social media as something that took place around 5 p.m. that day. This is 30 minutes after the Triton already left. And in this particular account, a Bertram boat was seen leaving shortly afterward at a high rate of speed. Now, this social media conversation claims that a person, one of the passengers, pretty certain Nolan Wells, was part of a group that was, quote, almost fighting around 5 p.m.
So where exactly did this claim come from? Here's the reporter who first brought this to the broadcast, laying out the source. It came from a message. A private message sent between two people who were loosely connected to this circle of friends. And in that message, someone described an argument that was apparently serious enough that the sender warned the other person they'd spend the rest of their life in prison. That's it. That's the entire foundation this claim is currently resting on. A secondhand account of a private message. Not a sworn statement to police. Not verified video footage. Not even a witness willing to go on the record with their name attached. That distinction matters enormously. And it's exactly where the panel that was assembled to discuss this claim split sharply down the middle. On one side, you had guests arguing that any credible account of a conflict involving Nolan in that window after the boat departed demanded immediate investigation. Fair enough, right? On the other side sat a forensic expert whose entire professional framework is built around what a body can and cannot tell you, and she wasn't willing to accept the claim without pushing back hard against it. It's worth pausing here for a second to ask a question. Why was a single private message, forwarded secondhand and described rather than actually shown, able to generate this much airtime on a national broadcast in the first place? Part of the answer lies in the specific gap this case has left open for weeks now. Investigators have not publicly detailed what, if anything, happened to Nolan between the moment his friend's boat departed and the moment his body was recovered days later. That silence doesn't just frustrate the public. It creates room. room for any new claim, however thinly sourced, to feel like a genuine breakthrough simply because there's so little else filling that specific window of time. A single unverified message about an argument becomes outsized in significance, not necessarily because of its own strength, but because of how empty the surrounding record still is. That's a pattern worth naming directly, because it's probably going to repeat itself again before this case reaches any kind of resolution. The less official information becomes available, the more weight any new claim, any rumor, any secondhand account tends to carry, simply by comparison. A single anonymous message shouldn't, on its own, be capable of reshaping the entire public understanding of someone's final hours. But in an information vacuum this deep, it can. And for one night, it did exactly that.
He dies. Nobody sees him. The others get back safely. Now we're hearing about an altercation afterwards, and I'm not ruling out that he was on that boat when they left, but now I'm hearing about an altercation. When you can't tell the truth of what's happening, look at who was angry. Look if there was an altercation. I don't know what happened, but when I hear altercation after the Triton left, I've got to go there.
You got to look at it. You absolutely cannot ignore it. But one thing we already know from the second autopsy, they would have mentioned if he had any type of injury to his knuckles, if he had been in a fight. We didn't hear anything about abrasions or bruising or any type of injury that would be indicative of somebody that...
Here's where the conversation turned genuinely adversarial. One expert raised a direct challenge to the entire theory. Her argument was straightforward. If Nolan had been in a physical fight serious enough to kill him, the independent examination that was performed on behalf of his family should have documented some corresponding injury. Torn knuckles, bruising on his hands, some kind of defensive mark. According to her, no such finding appeared in what's been reported from that exam. Now, that claim didn't go unanswered. A second forensic voice on the panel, a longtime death investigator with decades of casework behind him, pushed back on her reasoning almost immediately. And the exchange that followed became one of the sharpest disagreements in this entire case so far.
He did on Nolan's remains ranks right up there with the most thorough, hear me talking, the most thorough dissection that you can possibly do on human remains. It's the same one that we do on bodies that have died, individuals that have died that have been incarcerated, in custody deaths. You know what all that means: in the back of a cruiser, in a holding cell, in a prison. Those autopsies rank right up there with the most thorough that we can go. It's a very deep dive that they did on his body.
Joe Scott, you are stating that due to the level of decomposition in Nolan Wells' body, that you can't really figure out why his occipital bone area had deep reddening, and that was seen nowhere else in the body. That's because of decomposition. Isn't that true?
Well, it's true in the sense that that's what
Didn't you just say that?
I'm repeating what the physician said in his autopsy report. I didn't do the examination.
So then that would be a yes. So at that level of decomp that you're claiming could obscure the nature of the deep reddening on his occipital area, but yet on the other side of your mouth, you're claiming that even with this intense decomposition, you didn't see evidence of any reddening on his knuckles or any indication of a fight. So you want it two ways. You want to say, decomp, can't tell what that was on the back of his head, but even though he's highly decomposed, I can tell you, he didn't have any reddening on his knuckles. Really?
No.
Because I see a problem with that.
Okay, you've skinned your knee before, right? Okay. If you have an abrasion, that's completely different than a contusion. That means you have scraping and the tearing away of the skin. That's something that's very obvious. And guess what? I've been in enough fist fights in my life that I know what scraping. Right, I know, and you're misstating that because it's not a matter of reddening. When we look at hands, we also look at contact points where people are being abraded as a result of scuffing their hands. That's different than a color discoloration. We're talking about the top layer, the epidermis down to the dermis, is being scraped away. He doesn't see any evidence of that in his
I'm not
autopsy
talking
report.
about a scrape. I'm talking about if he had, for instance, reddening from a welt, the beginnings of a bruise. With that level of decomp, you're telling me you could still make that out?
Here's the counter-argument, delivered by someone whose entire career has centered on exactly this kind of forensic judgment call. The core tension in that exchange is worth sitting with for a moment. If decomposition was severe enough to obscure the true nature of an unexplained mark at the back of Nolan's head, could that same decomposition also be masking evidence of a struggle elsewhere on his body? Neither expert fully resolved that question on air. And it remains one of the central unanswered pieces of this entire theory. Now, if you appreciate a channel that's willing to walk through genuine expert disagreement instead of just picking a side and running with it, that's exactly the kind of coverage subscribing to this channel gets you. We're not interested in flattening a complicated forensic debate into a simple answer just because a simple answer performs better on YouTube. Stay subscribed, because the moment either side of this disagreement gets resolved by an actual released report, you're going to hear about it here first. The altercation claim wasn't the only new account entering this case that night. A separate report, surfacing through another commentator's platform, described a witness who claimed to have seen Nolan in the water alongside a young woman, not necessarily drowning, but appearing to struggle, distressed enough to draw the witness's attention and concern.
And he was with this girl.
You know, that's from Officer Tatum's show. Cheryl McCollum, it seems to me that that's not true. Because don't you think if a witness saw one or two people, quote, struggling in the water, I would try to help them.
It makes no sense.
And they
that
did
wouldn't
nothing?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. That wouldn't be their focal, that they would pay attention to those two people that are struggling to see, is one going under and not resurfacing? What can we do to help? The idea that they would watch that, see a struggle, and then what? Turn back and finish barbecuing? That doesn't make any sense to me at all.
So a second, entirely separate claim entered the conversation that same night. This one describing an entirely different kind of concerning moment. The panel's forensic expert immediately questioned the internal logic of that account. She asked, if someone genuinely witnessed two people struggling in open water, wouldn't the natural human response be immediate intervention? Not quiet observation followed by just returning to whatever else was happening on shore? Now, that skepticism doesn't prove the account false. It does highlight exactly why unverified, secondhand claims require far more scrutiny before they get treated as evidence. A veteran trial attorney on the panel offered a useful framework for thinking about all of this. One that's grounded in how courtrooms are actually built to handle exactly this kind of uncertainty. Competing, inconsistent accounts aren't unusual in an active investigation. They're not weird. They're not suspicious in themselves. They're actually the entire reason cross-examination exists as a legal tool. It's a mechanism for testing which version of events actually survives scrutiny once it's placed under pressure.
That come from people and verify what they're saying based on factors that don't get released in the media. So clearly something happened after 4:30 when the Triton boat apparently left. And all of these things the police will find, they will discover. You know, the police can discover whose phones were active at the time in that whole area if they choose. May not be able to use it in court anymore after the recent Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago on cell site location information. However, it's an investigative tool that they can line up who's there. They can also line these things up by the boats, right? And they're calling CETO and things like that. So these are all things the police are going to verify and shake out what they believe led to this young man's death.
I can get the GPS, Morse. I can get the GPS. I can get the cell phone data. I can get the tracking data. I can tell exactly what time the boat left. But I can tell the truth of that. But I can't tell the truth right now about these conflicting reports. Was he on the boat? His phone was on the boat. That's the whole point. He's traveling with his phone.
A trial attorney on the panel stepped back from the specific claims to explain what all of this actually means procedurally if it ever reaches a courtroom. And that's a genuinely important point, buried inside an otherwise pretty chaotic hour of competing theories. Every inconsistency currently circulating online, whether it holds up or eventually falls apart, becomes part of the evidentiary record that investigators are going to have to account for. and conflicting witness statements are precisely the kind of gap a defense attorney would seize on if this case ever reaches a jury. Underneath every one of these competing claims sits one piece of physical evidence that keeps returning to the center of the conversation: Nolan's phone. According to reporting, it remained aboard the Triton when that boat departed, a detail his own mother has repeatedly said is entirely out of character for her son.
Where's your cell phone? Where is your cell phone? And try not to lie. Where's your cell phone?
Okay. Right here.
Oh, really? Because here's mine. So, you want to tell me Nolan Wells stayed behind and his cell phone went without him? I understand, don't everybody start screaming that he didn't want to get it wet. Of course he didn't want to get it wet. But there's ways around that. You can go put it on shore in your shoe, like everybody else does, to hide it from people, and then retrieve it when you go. But no, he let the boat leave with his phone.
One detail keeps anchoring every version of this story, regardless of which theory you're following, and the panel returned to it directly. A phone left behind for practical reasons is a mundane, easily explained detail. A phone left behind by someone who, according to everyone who knew him, was never separated from it? That becomes something else entirely. A genuine anomaly that any competing theory of this case has to account for, rather than just explain away. It's worth pausing here to be explicit about what has and hasn't actually been established. Because a story this fluid can easily blur into settled fact if you're not careful about the distinction. It has been reported that the Triton departed Horn Island around 4:30. It has been reported that a private message referencing an argument involving Nolan exists and has circulated informally. It has been reported that no documented injuries consistent with a physical fight appeared in the independent examination as currently described. None of that constitutes proof of what actually happened to Nolan in the hours after his friend's boat left the island. It constitutes a set of loose threads, some more credible than others, that investigators, according to the panel's own legal analyst, are going to need to run down, verify, and either substantiate or discard before any of it becomes part of a formal case. There's a broader observation worth making about the phone itself, separate from the specific argument over whether its absence proves anything sinister. In nearly every version of this case that circulated publicly, from the earliest reporting through every subsequent theory, the phone keeps functioning as the one fixed physical anchor point everyone returns to. Timelines shift, witness accounts conflict, new claims about altercations and struggles surface, and get contested within the same broadcast. But the phone sitting aboard a boat that left without its owner remains the same, regardless of which competing narrative you're currently following. That consistency is exactly why it keeps resurfacing in every serious conversation about this case, and exactly why it deserves more sustained forensic attention than any single secondhand rumor about a fight nobody has yet been able to independently confirm. That verification process is already harder than it should be. And not simply because of the passage of time. Nolan's mother, according to reporting from this same broadcast, has faced anonymous calls specifically questioning her professional credentials as a nurse. An Act I journalist covering the case bluntly described as backlash tied directly to her son's death.
Mom is getting death threats. Nolan Wells' mother dealing with not only her son is gone, he's dead. The investigation going on. Now she's getting threats. Isn't it true, Susan Hendricks, joining us, investigative journalist, author of Down the Hill, My Descent into the Double Murder in Delphi, that someone actually called for an investigation into Nolan Wells' mother? Isn't she a home health care nurse?
She is, and it was an anonymous call saying that she needed to be investigated. To me, it was outright backlash connected to what happened to her son. It's despicable considering everything she's already going through. Anonymous calls to say that she's not up to par and needs to be investigated.
Away from the competing theories about what happened on that water, something else has been happening to the woman at the center of this entire search for answers. A mother waiting for confirmation of how her son died is simultaneously fielding attempts to discredit her professionally. An entirely separate cruelty layered on top of an already unbearable weight. And it's a detail that's easy to lose, beneath all the competing theories about boats and timelines. But it's happening, and it matters. So where does that leave this specific thread of the investigation? A forensic expert who had explained how her methodology would approach verifying the altercation claim laid out exactly what still needs to happen before any of this can move from rumor to established fact. Photographic evidence, if it exists. Direct witnesses willing to speak on the record rather than through secondhand messages. GPS data from any boat connected to the account, and a willingness from whoever holds this information to actually bring it to investigators rather than simply posting it online.
How would you go about investigating this altercation, this alleged altercation that took place after the Triton left? Placing Nolan still at Horn Island.
Sure. I need their photo evidence if they have it. I need the eyewitnesses, the ear witnesses, who saw what, when did they see it, how can they prove it? So if they can tell me who was in the altercation with him, then we're going to bring them in if they haven't been brought in. If there's some type of something they've captured on video or a photograph, that would be great. If it's associated with a boat, does that boat have GPS? When did that boat leave? Where did they go? I want all of that. So, you take the totality. You don't just take one thing. But, you're not going to take somebody's word that just put something on the internet. Have they gone down and talked to law enforcement? Will they come down and swear to what they are saying? That's where you're going to start.
Before the broadcast moved on, the same forensic expert who had pushed back hardest against this theory laid out exactly what it would take to change her mind. That's a meaningful standard. And it's the same one this channel intends to hold every future claim in this case too. Not whether something sounds plausible in isolation, but whether it survives contact with actual documentation, actual witnesses willing to be named, and actual investigators willing to verify it formally. If a case this layered, with this many competing threads, is the kind of story you want followed carefully, rather than resolved prematurely by whichever theory gets the most traction online, subscribing to this channel means you'll get every update the moment it's actually verified, not the moment it starts trending. This case is nowhere near finished, and neither is our coverage of it. It's worth stepping back from the specific claims for a moment to consider what this entire episode reveals about how a case like this one actually moves, or fails to move, toward resolution. A single evening's broadcast produced two separate unverified accounts, a genuine forensic disagreement between two credentialed experts, a legal framework for how conflicting testimony eventually gets tested, and a fresh detail about harassment aimed at a grieving mother. That's an enormous amount of material to generate in a single hour, and almost none of it moved this case measurably closer to an actual answer. It did, however, move public perception. And in a case this exposed to online speculation, those two things, actual evidentiary progress and shifting public perception, are not the same thing, even though they often get treated that way. That gap between perception and evidence is precisely why a forensic expert's standard for verification matters so much more than it might seem in the moment. Photographic proof, named witnesses willing to speak formally, GPS records tied to a specific vessel, a willingness to bring information to investigators rather than simply posting it for an audience. Every one of those requirements exists specifically because secondhand claims, however emotionally compelling, tend to fall apart under exactly that kind of scrutiny far more often than they hold up. That's not cynicism about the people making these claims. It's simply how unverified information behaves once real verification gets applied to it. Here is where things currently stand, stripped of speculation. Nolan Wells traveled to Horn Island with friends on the 4th of July. The boat he arrived on departed without him sometime around 4:30 that afternoon, and his phone departed with it. A claim has surfaced describing a possible altercation roughly 30 minutes later, involving people apparently unconnected to that original boat, based currently on a single secondhand account of a private message. A separate, similarly unverified claim describes Nolan appearing to struggle in the water with an unnamed young woman. Forensic experts reviewing the independent autopsy disagree sharply over whether the absence of documented injury rules out a physical altercation, given the degree of decomposition present by the time that exam took place. And throughout all of it, Nolan's mother continues waiting for real answers while simultaneously fielding attacks on her own credibility. None of these threads currently rises to confirmed fact. All of them deserve to be run down by people with the authority and the tools to actually verify them. Not simply repeated because they're dramatic enough to hold an audience's attention. That distinction between a compelling theory and a documented finding is the entire difference between understanding this case and simply being entertained by it. We'll be here when any of these threads gets resolved. Whether that resolution comes from a released report, a witness finally willing to go on the record, or a formal statement from investigators addressing the altercation claim directly. Subscribe now and turn on notifications, because whatever comes next in this case, you deserve to hear it explained carefully, not shouted across a panel of people who don't actually agree on what the evidence shows.